You're good to go.
All right, so we're going to talk about performing your best. As I just kind of gave you a little spiel, I'm Tyler Friedrich, Director of Olympic Sports Performance and Applied Sports Science at Stanford University. Just kind of what does that actually mean? It's a very long title. So I think we'll just kind of break it down. So what does that mean? Basically, our student athletes here at Stanford, they participate in strength and conditioning or weight training, performance enhancement training, and my job is to oversee all the training of all the sports that are non-football. So everything from basketball to sailing to fencing to volleyball to soccer. I oversee all of those, all the staff members who coach those teams. At its core, though, I'm a strength and conditioning coach. So my job is to improve the physical performance of our athletes. So by improving physical performance, that means doing things that you couldn't do, that the athletes couldn't do, or doing things that you could already do but better, right? So if I can jump 10 inches, but now I can improve that to 12 inches, that's performance, improving physical performance. And then maybe most importantly, the most important role that I have as a strength and conditioning coach is keeping our athletes healthy. And that's from an orthopedic standpoint. So obviously we want to avoid hamstring pulls, broken bones, things like that. So it's my job and our job to strengthen our athletes and make sure that they're in the proper condition and have the ability to handle the stress of sport or the stress of training without getting hurt. So, but I guess the real question is, like, being a strength coach and doing all these things, improving physical performance and getting better at things we could already do and staying healthy, that's all great. But to me, the real question is, how do we do that? How does a strength and conditioning coach do this? How can you apply this to your daily life or to what you're doing? And so the way we do it is we take a science-based approach to improve three main qualities or three main metrics. So that's strength, conditioning, and mobility. All right, so I guess strength and conditioning is kind of in the title, but we'll kind of go through each one and talk about mobility as we get to the end. So here we go. So strength, like what is strength? I think it's easy to know if you're strong, or maybe it's not easy to know if you're strong or you're weak, but if scientifically or like fundamentally, strength is the ability to maximally produce force. So think about if you're trying to lift a car versus lifting a peanut, which one requires you to use more force, lifting the car? So the stronger you are, the more force you can produce, the heavier things you can move. And improving strength is actually quite simple, relatively. It can be a little convoluted, but ultimately to improve strength, we need to apply a concept that's called progressive overload. And progressive overload is just slowly applying a stimulus over a period of time. And so you can see my little graph here. So it kind of like it's a wave that's slowly moving upwards over time. And so the way that works, and that's progressive overload, is the little arrows there. That's like a training session or a strength session or a run session or a practice, something like that. And so we apply a stimulus, and then there's a little dip. So that, if you run or if you lift weights, like you get sore or you get tired. So you apply a stimulus, strength stimulus. You go, you're tired, you're sore. That's that dip in the curve. And then you recover and you come back up and you apply stimulus again. Maybe a little more this time. Maybe you ran 1 mile last week and now this time you're going to run 1.5 miles. So a little more. You get tired, you get sore, and then you recover, and then you can apply a little more stimulus. So over time, we're slowly layering in more and more work, so that by the end here, if you go a month, 2 months, a year, whatever you want, whatever the training cycle is, by the end, we've gained more strength, right? So we're slowly applying the stimulus over time, using the moments of being fresh or being recovered, and using the moments of being tired and slowly using that to build ourselves up. And this is essentially the foundational science behind what I do, what a strength and conditioning coach does. You can't just never work out or never run or never lift weights and just kind of waltz on into the weight room and start lifting and get strong in one day. It's a slow progression over time. So the essence of being a strength coach is utilizing this science and using that to kind of build ourselves up. And you as an individual, if you are someone who is looking to get stronger, if you're looking to lift some weights, improve performance, whatever it is, it's the same concept. Just because you're not an athlete or you're not a collegiate athlete, you're not at Stanford or whatever the case may be, doesn't mean that this doesn't apply. Like if you are looking to gain strength, you apply the same concepts. Okay, so we talked about strength. So what were our three? Our three were strength, conditioning, mobility. So now let's go into conditioning. And conditioning it's kind of a fun one. So like what is conditioning? And essentially conditioning is your gas tank, to use a car analogy. So the bigger the tank, the longer you can go. So if you are more conditioned, you are more in shape, you are more fit, the more you can do. You can either run farther or do more or go longer, whatever it is. But what's really unique and what's really cool about conditioning, conditioning is a very broad term, but it's very specific to the activity or the sport or whatever it is that you're doing. So here's what I mean by that, by specific. Essentially, at a high level view, there's two methods of conditioning. There's aerobic conditioning and anaerobic conditioning. So aerobic conditioning is an oxygen-based conditioning. Our body is utilizing oxygen for energy, right? So it's mainly your heart and your lungs and their ability to get oxygen and blood out to your system as it's working, out to the muscles as it's working. So if we are training the aerobic energy system or the aerobic conditioning, we're basically trying to train our heart and our lungs to be more efficient at getting oxygen into the body, getting blood through the body. Now, the opposite of that is anaerobic conditioning. And anaerobic conditioning is like I said, literally the opposite. There's a lack of oxygen. So, and that's kind of weird to think, like how there's always oxygen in your body, but when you're doing things like short sprints, jumping, things that are really high intensity. So jogging is low intensity. Jogging is aerobic, right? It's you can jog for a long time. You can jog a mile much more easy than if you were to sprint a mile. Sprinting a mile is going to be anaerobic. You're going to be lacking oxygen. Your body has to utilize alternative sources of energy to propel itself, to fuel itself. And not to get too deep into the sciences here, but the two main sources are glycogen, ATP are the main two, and glycogen. And again, if this is too simple, like I apologize, but glycogen is basically it's stored in our muscles. It's when you eat things like carbohydrates, bread, pasta, whatever, it gets broken down into this thing called glycogen that's then stored in our bloodstream and in our muscles. When we do things without oxygen, our muscles are like, yo, I need energy. Where am I going to get it from? And it breaks down this glycogen to help give it fuel and move it forward. So when we do things like sprints, jumps, anything that's short but really, really hard is going to be anaerobic and using like muscle glycogen. So it's unique because there's two very ways, and the way you train them is very, very specific as well. So here we go. Like improving conditioning requires more specific training methodologies as compared to strength. Strength essentially, like if you want to get stronger, you have to be lifting heavier weights. Like it's about producing force. So it's very linear in nature. It's very much pretty straightforward. Like you want to get strong, you got to lift heavy weight. Conditioning is a little bit different, a little bit more finicky, a little trickier. If you want to improve your aerobic conditioning, you train differently than if you want to improve your anaerobic conditioning. So aerobic conditioning, long duration, low intensity, walking, jogging. So walking for an hour, jogging for an hour, or things like that is what would be aerobic. Long time, but relatively pretty easy. We want the body to be comfortable, relatively comfortable, and your heart rate doesn't get too high, so it can still be shuttling oxygen around the body. Once you get a little too tired, the heart rate gets a little too high, the muscles get a little too fatigued, we start breathing a little more shallow. You ever gone for a jog or a run and all of a sudden you're kind of breathing heavier? That's our body we're starting to lack oxygen in the bloodstream. So we start transitioning from aerobic to anaerobic. Anaerobic, short duration, high intensity, sprinting, jumping, things like this. So like just this short, high intensity stuff, things that really make you breathe hard, that kind of make you want to throw up after you do it. Because it's so intense that your muscles get so tired and get depleted so fast. So while we can be very specific with how we train conditioning or what type of training methodology we're going to implement, the concept is so similar to strength development. We apply a progressive overload over time. So you can't just go out and be like, you know what, it's time to get in shape. I want to get really good aerobic conditioning. I'm going to go run 5 miles today if you've never run before, right? So that doesn't make much sense. So we got to start at 1 mile, then maybe 1.5 miles, then 2 miles, and 2.5 miles. So we can slowly, same thing with the anaerobic. You say, you know, I'm going to work my anaerobic capacity. I'm going to go run some sprints. I'm going to run some stairs. You can't just go and do that right out the gate and be amazing at it. It takes time to get better at this stuff. So this is what we do with our athletes in strength and conditioning here at Stanford is we are training our athletes in both of these qualities. But first day they walk in, we're not just hammering them, we're slowly building up over time. And what's really cool about both of these qualities is that they're so closely related. They're so different. One is aerobic, one is anaerobic, one has oxygen, one doesn't. One's long duration, one is short duration. But what's really cool is like they're so closely related, and we can and probably should be training them at the same time. So I know I just went through this whole little spiel of, you know, if you want to do aerobic training, long duration, anaerobic, short duration, things like that. But we can actually train them at the same time, concurrently, is what that's called, concurrent training, and improve both simultaneously. And actually, the more aerobically fit we are, so the more capacity we have from an aerobic standpoint, the more anaerobically fit that we can become. So let's think about that. Like, aerobic is the ability to get oxygen to the muscles, which the muscles prefer, right? Our body, which is why we have low resting heart rates. We don't walk around sweating all the time because our body wants to use oxygen as an energy source. Oxygen is a very efficient energy source for our muscles and for our body. So the more capacity or the better our body is at utilizing oxygen, the longer we can use it. So all of a sudden we go from the more aerobically fit we get, our gas tank gets a little bit bigger. It's not even the gas tank gets bigger, it just gets more efficient. So think of a car that has 10 miles to the gallon or another car that has 40 miles to the gallon. They may have the same size gas tank. Let's call it a 15-gallon gas tank. Same size gas tank, but one of them empties a lot slower because it's a much more efficient engine. That's what we're trying to do. So if we have a high fuel efficiency, if we are much more efficient at utilizing oxygen and our heart is much more efficient at pumping blood out to the muscles, we can then go do that high intensity stuff, the jumping, the sprinting, things like that, and raise that ceiling as well. And that's how we train athletes here. That's how you can train yourself to become a better athlete, better at fitness. Is you apply these concepts together simultaneously, and as you raise your aerobic ceiling, anaerobic will follow with it. And so over time, you get super fit. Your work capacity gets really high, and think of any athlete. Again, here at Stanford, we have 36 sports. Again, everything from basketball to soccer to field hockey, a wide variety of needs, whether it be aerobic based, anaerobic based, but ultimately we have to train both because our athletes are going to have bouts of time where they need to be able to just be really fit and kind of bounce around and be moving at a slower intensity, and then other times when they have to sprint. So it's really important to layer these two together, not just focus on one or the other. Okay, the last thing is mobility. And so mobility is an interesting one. I think when you first think of a strength and conditioning coach or fitness or things like that, mobility, I think we think of getting stronger, we think of getting more fit, running more distance, things like that. But mobility is a really, really key part of everything we do. So and mobility I define mobility as the ability of a joint to move through a range of motion. So by range of motion, I mean if you lift your arm over your head, that's range of motion. From your side to over your head, you can't get your arm straight over your head. You're lacking mobility. It's not a very far range of motion. Now, I think a lot of people confuse mobility and flexibility. Flexibility is the ability of your muscle to stretch. So when you reach down and touch your toes, you feel a stretch in your hamstrings. That's flexibility. And they're both super, super important. But mobility is the key. Mobility plays into our ability to have good posture, whether we're standing or sitting. It can help if you are if you don't have good mobility, you could have just general pain, joint pain, low back, hips, ankles, things like that. It can affect your breathing. If your lower back and your hips and your upper back are not very mobile, it may affect your breathing, your ability for your lungs to expand, because those joints, your ribs are actually all like little joints as you go down the rib cage and as they attach to your spine. And if you're not mobile through that area, your rib cage can't expand when you breathe. So you may be just sitting there not able to take in as much oxygen as you could, which can affect cognitive function. It could raise your heart rate, things like that. And then the root of all this and the root of this job as being a strength coach is it can and it will affect performance, running, strength, sport performance, things like that. So it's really important to hammer in mobility and be able to move through ranges of motion. Again, there's kind of a common theme happening here that improving mobility is not unlike improving strength and conditioning. Like, we need to expose our body to different positions that it may not be able to successfully get into. And by positions, I mean, think about if you just were to be standing upright and then go down into a squat position. If you can't do that with your chest upright or your heels staying flat or your butt getting down, you can't get into that position. And so how do you get better at it? And the way to get better at it is to slowly expose your body to that position. Work on getting lower and lower and lower each time you squat. Work really hard at keeping your heels flat, keeping your chest up. Exposing your body to those positions are super, super important to successfully acquire that position over time. And things like yoga that come to mind. Yoga puts your body in these, if anyone's done yoga, it puts you in positions that maybe they're not accessible to you, but over time the body becomes more and more mobile in those positions. And this is something that we take a lot of pride in here at Stanford, and I think as being a strength and conditioning coach is something that is sometimes lost. We focus so much on strength and the conditioning side of things that we forget about, our athletes need to be able to move. Like when you're playing sports, if you're playing basketball and you can't bend your knees to get in a good position to play defense, or you can't lift your arm as high over your head if you're trying to go and block a shot or get a rebound, it's going to affect your ability to be effective at your sport. And so hammering away at mobility is super, super important. It's a daily thing. But what's really cool about mobility is as you acquire, as is strength, as is conditioning, as you get better, acquire these new positions, like you're going to feel so much better. And then because you're a little bit more mobile, because your joints have a little bit more freedom to move, all of a sudden you're a little bit stronger. Running's a little bit easier. So these things all layer together to help us improve just general performance. So I kind of just started touching on this, but how this all relates to each other. And I mentioned like the underlying theme here is or there is an underlying theme associated with improving strength and conditioning and mobility, and it's called the SAID principle. And SAID is an acronym for specific adaptations to imposed demands. Long way of saying that your body adapts to what you expose it to. So if you run 1 mile and then you slowly over time add that distance as you run, your body will adapt to those demands. Strength training, if you are doing bench press and you bench press 40 pounds and then 45 pounds and then 50 pounds over time, your body is getting stronger. It's adapting to those demands placed upon it. Same thing with mobility. If you're unable to reach down or reach your hands over your head and keep your arms straight or get in a squat position, but you slowly over time keep doing it, your body will adapt. And I think the bottom line or the key is like to gain these improvements, that you must expose your body. That's just how our bodies work. Our bodies want to be at what's called homeostasis, which is basically just being normal. But we can change what normal means. We can improve homeostasis. So by doing strength training and conditioning training and mobility training, we can improve. We can shift. So our body says, "Oh no, like you just did a bunch of push-ups. I don't like this. I'm going to repair this muscle, and then I'm going to be ready next time you do this because I don't like being under that stress." That's the SAID principle. That's improving. That's adapting. So I think, kind of in closing here, if you want to get strong, you need to lift weights. If you want to get in shape, you have to do some sort of cardiovascular activity or conditioning activity. And if you want to get mobile, you need to work those joints. So while, we talk about SAID principle and talk about progressive overload and talk about using glycogen and ATP and oxygen and kind of get kind of sciencey as we start doing this, the moral of the story is, like, you got to lift weights if you want to get strong. If you want to get in shape, you got to run a little bit. If you want to get mobile, you have to work on mobility. And that's something that, as a strength and conditioning coach, we sit here and we assess the needs of our athletes, and a soccer player's needs from a strength, conditioning, and mobility are probably different than a volleyball player, but it's really important for us to assess those needs of the athlete, of the sport. What does their sport require? Do they require them to be stronger or be more in shape? And then we train using these principles. We train these things in order to improve our athletes' ability to physically perform on and off the field. And that is it. I don't know if there's a Q&A. I can stop sharing my screen if I can figure it out. Stop sharing.
There you go. It should be that same button.
So now what do I do?
All right. Did you hit the stop sharing button?
I think so, yes.
Okay, perfect. I will go ahead and I'm going to stop the recording so that we can start the Q&A session, okay?
Sounds great.